Hello to everyone, wherever you may be. So we are now at week 2. You're all doing well, I hope. This week, I have uploaded just for you 4 voiceover presentation videos covering not only the topics for this week, but also backtracking a bit to the readings I uploaded last week. Yes, I start with a 12-minute video of the readings, review of the readings, adding a bit of meta information about the author and the context of the articles as a way of enhancing your understanding of them. Then we go to the heavy, close to a half-hour presentation of the national landscape, or how the domestic situation influences or affects the formulation and implementation of Philippine foreign policy. In particular, I go over the Philippine Development Plan 2017 to 2022, or PDP, and pick out which domestic policies there have foreign policy implications, their targets, the time frame for the policies, and the relevance or impact to other states. It's a bit of a dense watch, so you may wish to thumb through the abridged copy of the PDP as a reference while you're watching it. It should be uploaded sometime this week as well. Now, the third video goes over the history and definition of an independent foreign policy before and after that phrase was enshrined in the 1987 Constitution as the cornerstone of foreign policy making in the Philippines. However, it leaves to future presidents to define it as they saw fit. Finally, the fourth video enumerates the 9 realities all Filipino leaders have to consider or contend with in the post-Cold War era. Whether these realities will experience a change or not in the few years remains to be seen. So if you're ready, let's all dive in.
Part 1. By now you will have gone through Module 1, Basic Terms and Concepts of Foreign Policy, as well as the 3 readings uploaded in BigSky based on articles written by Renato De Castro, Wen Zha, and Ariel Nepomuceno. The handouts I uploaded were intended to have been complete. However, apart from the Nepomuceno article, which you can find on Google, the other 2 full articles are available upon request in order to fully comprehend the sense of what the authors wanted to convey in those studies. Now, just to summarize, the 2010 article by Dr. Renato De Castro entitled Weakness and Gambits in Philippine Foreign Policy in the 21st Century analyzed the record of the 9-year administration of President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who took half of the term of the disgraced former President Joseph Estrada and won on her own right a full-fledged term of 6 years in the highly controversial elections of 2004, which, as you are aware, were marred with irregularities, notably the Hello Garci scandal. Now, the thesis of Dr. De Castro, who by the way is a full professor in the International Studies Department of De La Salle University, just next door, is that President Arroyo undertook bold diplomatic gambits, as he called it, when she tried to address issues facing the Philippines back then on national security, which we know to be both domestic and international terrorism, and economic development, where she sought to enhance the competitiveness of the Philippines in the global market. Now, I can't say or ask you to remember because you were only but children at that time, but please understand the context of the era and what the country had gone through in the 5 years prior to the period being studied by Dr. De Castro. Domestically, the Philippines had gone through another extra-constitutional change in leadership 15 years after the country became synonymous with people power and, of course, what we call in the Philippines as the EDSA Revolution. And then, after that, just a few months later, there was an incident dubbed EDSA 3, which not only highlighted the infighting between political families, but also exposed a yawning gap between the elite supporters of a more traditional and established political family and the poor supporters of a then rising one. This domestic instability was not helped by mass fears, we can say even hysteria, over a global system-wide technological glitch, which some people had been warning would eventually lead to a global collapse of computer systems and mainframes, and had thus received the nickname Y2K, since it was due to take place at the end of December 1999. And then there was also the Asian economic crisis, which fortunately left the country in a relatively better shape than most Asian economies, whose exposure, especially the weakness of their currencies, ended up hurting their economies in one of what they now say is a global economic crisis that occurs every decade or so. And of course, who can forget the unprecedented attack against the mainland United States of America that took place in New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia on the 11th of September 2001. And of course, I mention this because the United States had not been attacked, at least in the mainland, since 1812. And you can see how what a collective trauma this must have been for the Americans. And as we can see, even 19 years later, they continue to observe this anniversary. However, I'd like to point out that the observance of it, even though it resulted in a global shock, was muted elsewhere. And now it seems a bit quaint in a very almost apocalyptic year in 2020, that almost two decades later, homegrown terrorism, either by lone wolf mass murderers or white supremacists, appears to be a greater menace to U.S. society now than any foreign terrorists. And finally, we do have the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, which established a pattern for the United States of military adventurism that continues to this day. So that is the context by which Dr. De Castro starts his study. And it was against this milieu of global shifts that Arroyo found herself in trying to balance the major powers, United States, China, and Japan, in East Asia, and to try to fix itself, her administration more fully in the regionalist embrace of ASEAN, which, fortunately for her, had proved to be a useful vehicle in convincing China to sign a milestone document in Manila in 2002, which is, I'm referring to the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, or the DOC. The DOC, also referred to as the Manila Declaration, was the result of deft foreign policy maneuvering by the Arroyo administration that had to some degree assuaged hurt Filipino pride from the loss in 1995 and 1998 of Mischief Reef, an atoll which is located 130 nautical miles west of Palawan in the Philippines' Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. Apart from that, the Arroyo administration had to explore new export markets and attract foreign tourists and investments in order to improve its economic standing, as well as protect the interests and the well-being of overseas Filipino workers. Dr. De Castro's conclusion was that whatever successes Arroyo may have achieved through these major diplomatic gambits were constrained by the country's political and economic weaknesses. When we look at the second article, entitled Personalized Foreign Policy, Decision-Making, and Economic Dependence, a comparative study of Thailand and the Philippines' China policies, written in 2015 by Dr. Wen Zha, we find that some weaknesses of the Philippines, in particular corruption and weak political institutions, as well as an underdeveloped economy with such a low manufacturing base and thus few significant trade or investment that could be leveraged by China, resulted in what she called policy discontinuities in Arroyo's foreign policy towards Beijing. It is worth noting that while the two authors covered a time period that had a significant overlap and drew more or less similar findings as far as how domestic weaknesses in the Philippines adversely affected its foreign policy, Zha perceived this negative result from the point of view of China's inability to unduly influence the Philippines into maintaining under the new Aquino administration, the friendly foreign policy his predecessor government had towards China. Now, she contrasts it with the way Thailand, which had in fact experienced greater political instability with the different changes of prime ministers than the Philippines in the same period, ended up having a more stable foreign policy towards Beijing. De Castro ended his article with a warning. Unless the Philippines puts its house in order, builds comprehensive political, military capabilities, and economically keeps pace with more dynamic neighbors in East Asia, it will remain a weak power in the world of the strong. Now, as Filipinos, let us consider the similar finding by Dr. Zha, who, by the way, appears to be a Chinese patriot if one looks at her experience as an opinion editor and editorial writer of the Global Times, Huanqiu Shebao, a daily tabloid newspaper that takes a strong nationalistic perspective on all international issues under the auspices of the Chinese Communist Party's People's Daily newspaper. Now, I am not in any way belittling or denigrating her experience. In fact, just for your information, Dr. Zha is an associate professor of Southeast Asian politics, ethnic conflicts, and Chinese nationalism at the Institute of International Relations at the China Foreign Affairs University, CFAU, in Beijing, which is essentially the training school for party cadres who want to join the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs or work in the field of diplomacy in some capacity or other. Dr. Zha finished her Master in Arts at the University of Warwick in the UK and her PhD in Political Science at the National University of Singapore. So as you can see, Dr. Zha is quite an accomplished political science and international relations expert. Her article, which I hope some of you would opt to read in its entirety, appeared in the renowned internationally peer-reviewed academic journal, Contemporary Southeast Asia, which is published thrice a year by the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute, a reputable public institution in Singapore. Now let's turn to her article. Based on Dr. Zha's conclusion, in certain instances, personalization of foreign policy in small states like the Philippines and Thailand, as stated by some orthodox international relations experts, is not enough to prevent discontinuity of policies between changes in administrations or governments. Indeed, Dr. Zha places economic dependence on a major power, in this case, as a bigger factor determining constancy. Now, how do I view this as a Filipino diplomat? I found the results to have a silver lining if we look at it from another perspective. While foreign policy discontinuities do result in opportunity costs, among other things, the resulting indifference of the Aquino administration to Beijing's attempt to use economic threats to force its will on Manila, and if you remember, this was around 2012 when the Aquino administration was having a lot of difficulties with Beijing's behavior in the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea. So the indifference by the Aquino administration to Beijing's attempt to use economic threats to force its will in Manila showed how ineffective China's economic policy had been as a lever or a leverage in influencing Philippine behavior. All of which, of course, I would consider as something positive in contrast with the conclusion that Dr. De Castro had in his own article. So it really depends on the situation, and one could draw different conclusions even if one does end up with the same findings.